My guest today is Dr. Jennifer Shepard, an accomplished HR leader with a focus on HR ecosystems training and development and performance optimization. With a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology and extensive global experience, Jen brings valuable cross-cultural insights to every project she takes on. As a neurodiverse professional, she also brings authentic, human-centered approaches to complex challenges, always grounded in deep expertise, warmth, and a contagious energy that draws people to her. She's also moderated the LEWAS Amplified Video podcast and regularly appears on panels across the Middle East. Now based in Rome with her beloved rescue dog Kobe, whom she found in Saudi Arabia, Jen is the founder and CEO of Igniting Inclusion Consulting. Through coaching, facilitation, and strategic advising, she helps organizations build healthier and more human-centered workplaces. And without further ado, let's just jump into this conversation. Hi, Jen. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to share my journey with people. I love talking.
And on that note, when we spoke last time, I still remember you said, I know I'm different. So, talk to me about what does this mean?
It's funny. It took me a long time to be able to say the words, I'm different. Because, when you're growing up, especially as a child, you're kind of taught how to fit into boxes and what's expected of you. And the world seems very small at times. Because you're trying to form relationships, you're trying to meet friends, and this happens throughout your life, right? So it doesn't always make sense why you don't maybe fit in, why, as a kid, maybe you're bullied. And I did go through that. And I went through it through most of my schooling. And I kept saying, why is it me? Why am I being picked on? And I think that by the time I realized, I was able to say, you know what, I'm just different from people. I was probably in college, probably towards the end of college, where I started to understand more about even how my brain worked, how I functioned, how I built relationships and understood people and interacted with people, because I was realizing that I was different and there was a reason for it, because it was actually in college and undergrad where I was officially diagnosed with ADHD. And, when I was a kid, they didn't diagnose little girls with ADHD. It didn't exist for us. And they thought if you did have it, you were a little boy and you would grow out of it when you were 16. And even then, when I was diagnosed in university, they didn't give us medicine for that either, because they believed you grew out of it at 16. So I was kind of thrust into this realization about myself because I didn't really connect with other kids. I spent a lot of time alone, reading books. In my imagination, I had an imaginary friend. I didn't really like the things other kids liked. I was not a let's go play sports kid. I was, let's, play Queen of England in the backyard and figure it out. And people were like, what is wrong with you? And because it just wasn't what kids were doing. I was asking questions all the time, and I was spending a lot of time with adults because I wasn't connecting with the kids. And generally in a lot of places, especially when I was very young, I was growing up in a neighborhood where I was the youngest, and the other kids were 3-4 years older than me. So it was enough of a difference when you're 3 versus 7 that, and maybe even more than that now that I think about it, it was enough of a disconnect that you just have no one to really connect with. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a slow process for me to understand that I didn't fit into the world the way other kids did, and I didn't always understand why. And for a long time, I thought that made me not as good as other people, for lack of a better way of describing it. I felt lonely, and I felt like, why can't I just be like the other kids? Why can't I just want to go play softball and things like that? And I would go play and try to fit in, but it didn't always resonate. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the thing, is realizing slowly that these things about me, it wasn't because there was something wrong with me. It just was who I was.
Thank you for sharing this, Jen. This really sort of sets the tone for the, conversation. And I think your sharing this will resonate with so many people, either to educate them or to relate to it, right? I'm going to unpack this a little bit more, Jen.
Okay.
So when you said that I didn't say it too often and I knew I was different, so was this for your consumption, or therefore, giving you clarity and helping you reframe perspectives? Or was it that you would start saying it to the people as well? And here's where I'm coming from, that, a lot of times you'd say, I'm different to somebody. They'll say, that's your problem, not mine.
Yeah.
I don't think empathy comes so easily. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say I didn't start telling people that I was different. Like when we first met, and that was like the first thing I said to you, I would say that it was actually only in probably the last 8 or 9 years that I was able to say that comfortably and see it as more of a strength than something to be ashamed of. Because again, there's a certain expectation of how women should behave, I should say, how educated women should behave, how professional women should behave. Like there's so many different expectations and boxes you're supposed to fit in. And I realized that I just don't fit into those. And it led to some issues while I was working as I was growing up. And I would say, I just don't understand why maybe somebody doesn't like me for no reason. Like my existence, people didn't like me, didn't like working with me. And it was hurtful. And it was like a series, I guess, of events throughout my life, certain, moments where someone would say, you think differently than they do. You see problems differently than they do. And because they can't see it the way you do, they are frustrated by that. And that was kind of the messaging at different points and pieces that I would get. But I would say, well, so am I doing something wrong? And they would just say, why are you stressing about the people that don't like you? And that was a big one for me. And I think I still resisted a lot of this personally because I wanted people to like me. I wanted to get along with people, right? And I think the biggest shift for me was when I was working at Saudi Aramco and I was designing a lot of the diversity courses. And we were trying to have conversations about the importance of different perspectives and thinking differently. And I started to see that the way that I was doing things was more and more appreciated. And the way I would facilitate around some of these things, the stories that I would tell, the way I would tell stories, it really resonated with people. And I would get comments saying, I love the way you think. I love the way you present. And I found myself thinking less about who didn't like me and more about, hey, this is a strength that I have. And I think going back to thinking about the boxes that women are supposed to fit into, a lot of times we're also told you should not be, it's not common practice to say, I'm good at something, right? Because there's kind of a little bit of, oh, why aren't you being humble? And it's like, I can say, I think I'm good at this without being ridiculously braggadocious, right? But that was something I wrestled with as well. And I remember I was facilitating a session with somebody who teaches a lot of emotional intelligence courses throughout the Middle East. And he facilitate courses with me. And he came and did a module with me in a course that I had designed called Emerging Women in Leadership. And we were talking about the first session that I designed, the day one was know and show yourself, basically. And so I would do a day where we would talk about your values and all of these other pieces. And then the last piece was the emotional intelligence. He would talk about the DISC and stuff like that. And he was, of course, sitting in the back of the room the entire time with my supervisor. And I remember thinking to myself, it's my first year working at Aramco. I'm nervous to be watched, right? Especially by somebody that I've heard. I mean, he was well known. Somebody who was like, oh my gosh, he's coming. You're so lucky, right? That kind of a level. And I was super intimidated. And we had a break. So I'd done this session with everybody and we were having a great conversation and we went to break and he pulled me aside and he said, I need to tell you something. He was like, I am so impressed watching you. He goes, you have this incredible ability. I've almost never seen it in anybody else, to take in all this information from these responses and put it together and put it back out in a way that is digestible and understandable to the entire room. He's like, you have a way with storytelling that is incredible. And I just wanted to tell you, and I think you're going to do amazing. And I just kind of was like, what? I think my voice went up like 3 octaves and he was, thank you, because I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
For me, what's going on in my brain is often chaotic and like you're pulling from a million things at once. And I didn't realize that the output that I was providing felt so helpful and useful. And actually, people were impressed by it. And so that started me thinking like, it's okay to feel like I'm good at something, because thought I was just doing improv, right? But he's like, you're doing so much more than just improv. And my supervisor even backed him up on this and later said, I was completely blown away by seeing you, because you know this material so well, you know this stuff so well that you can spin circles around it and bring everybody back. And I just thought, wow. Because throughout periods of my career, there would be times where I'd be presenting on something and someone would say, well, you didn't do it exactly as we said you should. And I'm like, why? Why do we have to do it that way? There's so many ways of thinking and doing things. If I have to do an interpretive dance, I will. I've threatened it many times over the years.
So when your ADHD was diagnosed, because you were a woman, it was sort of dismissed, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And then you also said later on that because you were a woman, you're not supposed to be saying you're good. So, I was just curious that you think it's a different thing, you think it's a woman thing, you think it's a cultural thing, because today I'm hearing so many nuances to this one little.
Yeah. And I think, for a long time, I thought it was maybe the American way. It was just the way I grew up, right? But as I've, moved around the world and had different interactions, different countries, I think it is a thread that we share. I mean, people may know this, but in 2020, the UN issued a study about kind of the status of women in the world. And they found that 87% of the countries they surveyed still had significant biases against women. And it was really fascinating to me to think about all of the shared experiences that we have as women, even though there's going to be different cultural underpinnings there. And the way that looks in each culture is, of course, going to be different in some ways. But it's still going to be shared, where you just said, the energy, the number of times where I would get excited and like my voice would raise and I'd just be like, oh my gosh, and guys, we're going to do this. And someone would be like, can you just not right now? Can you just tone it down? And what happens then? We shut down.
Yes.
Right? We stop. I could be in the middle of a brainstorming, excited, sharing an idea, telling a story. And the second someone's like, oh God, could you not? You're exhausting. You're just, okay. Because as a woman, I wasn't supposed to be that way. There was much more patience for young boys to be energetic, because if you think about, I grew up in the 80s, which the world was shifting, but there was still some very traditional things where you'd expect girls to be having quiet tea parties and with their animals sitting around them. And the boys would be the ones running, playing football, screaming, doing all this stuff. And then, but if you heard the girls screaming, you were like, why are they making so much noise? Yeah. The sugar and spice and everything nice. And I think almost every culture has some form of that in some traditional ways that we're starting to move away from now in this day and age. But at that time, it felt personal. And as I got older too, I was working with people that believed that. So I found myself doing something which you probably have heard of when you mask. You're like, how do I fit into this box so that people feel like they can connect with me? But then you get exhausted by the end of the day.
Let's shift gears. And the next word I'm hearing a lot is cultures, right? Love for you to share a story or a moment that really captured the cultural contrast for you between the US and the Middle East.
Setting a little bit of context there, I think, is, in the months before I went to Saudi Arabia, we were given several orientation sessions by people that really hadn't spent any time in Saudi other than maybe a visit with the company to see the facilities and things like that. And so I sat in a room for like 3 days with a couple other people, and we were being told, this is what it's like, this is how you behave, this is what you do. And so sometimes it felt very overwhelming. And of course, being from the United States and going to Saudi Arabia, there's only certain things you would hear about in the media. And like if you Google something, the algorithm was not friendly. So even though I was excited to do it and very much looking forward to it, it was still like, oh my gosh, I'm a little nervous, right? And I remember getting to Saudi maybe 2 weeks before Ramadan started. and being told, oh, you're not allowed to even like be out alone as a woman. You know, I remember getting off the bus for the first time to go to the mall and thinking like, should I be nervous? Should I be scared? Should I be covering my hair? Even though they told us you didn't have to cover your hair. And I started to realize pretty quickly that, you know, some of the things that I was told were not necessarily true, or they might have been true, but they were no longer true. People were very nice, very friendly, very open. And me being me, I was instantly like, well, I want to just try to get to know people and be friendly because I don't know any other way to be. That is my culture. But I think the one that really stopped me in my tracks and made me really think about even like my own biases and expectations was early on walking down this wide hallway in our company. And there was some gentleman walking towards me in full traditional Saudi clothing. And I remember thinking like, oh, I'm going to just, you know, like smile, say good morning, you know, things like that. Because I thought that's respectful of me to do that. And so I did that as they were walking by. I was just like, good morning. And the man who was closest to me, it was kind of like they were in a four and then a fifth man in the front. And so the man in the front kind of turned his back to me as they walked by. And inside my head, I went, that was so rude.
Rude.
How could you? How could you? You know, there's like, you had all the emotions at one time. And I was fired up internally. Obviously, I said nothing. I did nothing. But I was hurt. I was angry. And I was like, oh, so this is an example of not respecting women, right? You know, like in my head, I was like, the things they say are true. And this is so upsetting. For anyone listening, no, calm down. We're going to get there. I remember going back to my division head at the time, who was a lovely Saudi woman who I'm still very, very good friends with to this day. Her name is Reem. And I went in and we were talking about something and I was like, this just happened and I'm really upset. And I told her the story and I was like, can you believe that? It was so rude. And she just sat there, as she often did with me, where she would just sit there and kind of smile and, okay, whenever you're done, you know, because she knew I needed to get it out. Right. And she'd say, so can I give you another perspective? And I was like,
Oh,
yeah, I would love a different perspective, please. And she was like, so it's actually a sign of respect, what you just saw. And I was like, a sign of what? You know, because it was that moment, like everything that I had assumed and been taught was flipped over on its head. And she further explained more and sharing like, hey, it is not appropriate really to meet a woman's eyes. And of course, 2016, this day and age, some people have changed their opinions on that. But at the time, things were still shifting. It was still a little bit more conservative than it is now. And I was really not prepared for that answer. And it was in that moment that I thought, like everything that I've been told is not true. And I have to start fresh. And so I was often having an inner dialogue when I would do something where I still would say good morning because we were a company that had, 90 different nationalities in it. But I also was not angry if someone didn't greet me. And some people would. Some people would shake my hand. Some people wouldn't. Some people, had their own ways of greeting and interacting. And I think that was a big moment of like understanding the differences in the culture and appreciating those differences and wanting to learn so much more.
On this, I'm going to do like a follow-up question.
Okay.
So like you said, I kept saying good morning. My question is, were there any time when this Americanness felt like a mismatch? And then if yes, how did you navigate those moments? Especially when, cultural expectations probably clash with your sense of self.
Yeah. I would say my Americanness has shown up in certain things like hierarchy. Because in the US, we're so used to this flat kind of a structure in most places. And if there is a hierarchy, it's kind of a soft hierarchy.
Sure.
Right? Because I could always go into the CEO's office of the company that I worked for previously and say, hey, we need to have a talk. That was not allowed. And sometimes even in extreme cases, like the order you put someone's name on an email string, someone would say to me, you have to put this person's name first. And I'd be like, really? So like things like that, I think. I struggled with up until the very end, and some of the protocols, oh, you can't enter a room until this has happened, or you simply can't do this. And it's like, but why? Which is a long-standing theme in my life. I was always asking why.
But you did adapt to this.
I did adapt to it, obviously. And I would say sometimes the way in which I spoke is another kind of Americanness, where we tend to speak very directly, and a lot of Middle Eastern cultures are more, you just have this conversation about high context, low context, right? So, even though I grew up in an Italian-American family and we were, I say, more on the Italian side, so we had a little bit more of a mixture of that high and low context, nothing comes close to the way that showed up in, I think, Saudi culture, where just the flick of an eyebrow sent 20 messages to people and I missed it. Right. So that was an interesting way in terms of understanding what was being said versus what was implied. And that took a little bit of learning. And some people found us very frustrating because we like to repeat ourselves. We like to come back with summaries after a meeting and they'd be like, "Hey, we agreed to this. Let's just go."
So did you find any unexpected bridges between these cultures, things that made you feel more connected than you thought you'd be?
Yeah. It was funny because growing up in an Italian-American family, the things we valued so much were, family, food, of course. And I found out really quickly that it was the same in Saudi. People were like, "Come eat with us, come to my house, have coffee. We'll go, sit down and have a chat." And like that idea of community and family and culture was so ingrained that I used to joke with people that Italians and Arabs are so closely aligned. All that's different is the spices.
Right.
Because you would go to someone's house and they'd be like, "Oh, are you hungry?" And you're like, no, I just ate." And then you'd end up with a table full of food. Or we just made a snack and there'd be a smorgasbord of food out. And my mother does the same thing. I would come home and say, "Oh, no, I just ate." And she'd be like, "But I made you a snack." And there'd be like a charcuterie board in front of you. And you're like, "What am I supposed to do with this?" And it's like you connect through food.
Yeah.
And also the humor part of it. One thing I think people didn't realize about a lot of Saudis and Arabs in general, they're hilarious. They are so funny and they love joking. And so because I'm somebody who likes to joke around as well, especially doing diversity and inclusion work, like you can't take yourself too seriously or anybody else, right? We have to be willing to laugh at ourselves. We would sit in a course, I'd be facilitating and people would just burst out laughing. And because things are funny, people are funny inherently, especially when we're a little bit uncomfortable, right? And I think that surprised me because there was that bridge where we had kind of a collective understanding that we could find things funny and share what was funny, so.
Mm-hmm. You went on to do a PhD and took on very demanding roles. And then you also spoke about navigating ADHD, right? So was it a moment when you felt that your way of thinking is now your superpower? Like, how did you navigate it?
Yeah. Sometimes I still wonder how it happened. Because I did my master's in training and performance improvement. And because at the time I was working as a lead facilitator, I was big into learning and development because, when I finished my master's, I was working for a company. We did breast cancer research and we worked with 36 different countries around the world. And I was fascinated by all of the ways in which people interacted, those different cultural structures. And the thing was that we tended to struggle with was like getting people to care as much as we did about our own stuff, right? And I would build these courses and I would spend so much time and put my heart into them and I would facilitate them and people would say, "These are great, they're wonderful, but we just don't care." And I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, that hurts." And then as I was finishing up my master's, I was thinking about what my next steps would be and thinking, I feel like there's more. I'd always wanted to do a PhD, but when I was in undergrad, I thought I'll do a PhD in women's studies. And my parents were like, "What are you going to do with that? How are you going to eat?" And I thought, well, there's other ways around that. How do we find something? And I ended up stumbling on the program at the time, which was not popular in a lot of universities. Now it's more popular, but it was industrial and organizational psychology. And I realized this is what I've been missing, right? Because how do I get people to care? How do I ensure that what I'm doing is not only aligned with what people need to learn to do their jobs, but also How does it fit into the ecosystem? What motivates people? I had so many questions. And so I was like, I'm going to do this. And so I was fortunate to be able to enroll in Capella University. And people have a lot of feelings about online universities. I know this. But for me, because of my ADHD, I struggled really, really badly with standardized testing. The GRE and I were hot and cold because I had taken, a practice version just to see how I would do, and the amount of stress that I had and anxiety as the questions got harder. And then also, I have a documented learning disability in math, which was something they found out about me when I was like 2 or 3 years old, and they tested me. And they said to my mom, Jen is very intelligent. She could come to the gifted school, but she will always struggle with math. So I just could not get over the hump of the GRE. And I was terrified of it because at the time, if you took it, that was your score. If you took it again, they averaged your score. The terror was real. And at the time, Capella did not require you to take the GRE. If you did it, great. They would take your score. But if you didn't, your way through that was to have letters of reference, to share your transcripts, to write an essay for yourself, and also be willing to show maybe some examples of work that you've done. And I was like, that I can do. No problem. That's good. And also, hey, universities, maybe consider that. So I did it, and it took me longer than probably most people. Also because I took a year off for moving to Saudi. I had taken almost another year off when I was laid off from a previous position while I was trying to sort through things. And there was times during it where I thought, I'm going to quit. I'm not smart enough for this, especially when I got to inferential statistics. And then oddly enough, inferential statistics was the course that I got A's in because something finally clicked with my brain, right? Where I was like, these numbers actually tell a story. Whereas when you're in school and they try to say, Emma has 20 barrels of apples. And if Emma gives 10 barrels of apples to George, how many apples does George have? And you're like, what? I was the kid that was like, why are we putting apples in barrels? Like, what is happening? Right? So, those word problems never resonated with me, but the statistical analysis part, I found so interesting, and the stories that it could tell. And it was hard because I had to be so super disciplined. I can remember getting ready to go to Saudi, and I'll never forget the dates because of just when things were happening. I left for Saudi Arabia on May 22nd of 2016. I was doing my comprehensive exam in the few weeks beforehand, and I had to actually bring myself to the library and lock myself in a room because, of course, I'm packing up my house. I'm getting ready to move to the other side of the world. I am stressed out about a new job, what to do with my dogs, because my dogs weren't able to come with me like it was at first. And I had to lock myself into this room. And I learned this about myself over the years, that when I needed to really, really focus, I had certain tricks that I needed to do to trick my brain into going, you have no other options. You have to do
What are those tricks?
Locking myself into the room in the library, or bargaining with myself. You can't leave this spot until you've completed 3 pages of writing. Or, I set alarms for myself. I was hard on myself when I needed to be. And the thing is, once I started getting into things that I was very interested in, it was easier for me to do that. But I had to also be careful not to burn out. And the good thing with the library is, like, I could get there at 10 a.m. and leave at 6 p.m. because they would close. And I would say, go home, make dinner, sleep, then come back tomorrow. And I even had people that would hold me accountable, where I would say, if you see a text message from me before this time, you yell at me. And people would, because they knew. And when I got to Saudi, it was a case of I would go to the library sometimes. I had a spot in my house also that I'd set up as my work area, or I would go into the office on the weekend and I would sit there and I would type all day long. Because it was easier for me to get into the space, because I'm not one of those people that can work from home really. Like, I'll do it if I have to, but my brain needs a space, so that was also my thing. Location was a big deal for me.
A lot of times they say that if you've found your North Star, if you found something you absolutely love doing, ADHD will never come in your way. Then it's your superpower. Is that a myth or is that correct?
So I think, yes, for a long time, I've been very lucky because the things that get me going and most excited are being creative, and having multiple things to work on. If you give me one thing to do for forever, I will die on the vine. And that was something that an old supervisor said to me. She saw it in me very quickly that I needed to move from different projects to keep my brain engaged, and to create new ideas. And so those things also drove me to have, a wider understanding. And I think that it became my ability to see things differently, was a superpower in its own way. But sometimes it was frustrating because I was often told by people around me, you're 5 or 10 steps ahead and we don't see how you got there.
Yeah.
And I would try to explain how I got there and nobody was following me. And so that sometimes was difficult. I think once I understood and did more research about ADHD, it helped me to understand how and why I did certain things. So I wasn't overthinking those things so much anymore. And I would just sometimes be more comfortable saying, look, this is the way my brain operates. Let me know if something isn't clear. And sometimes people would just say, let her go. Just let her go. We'll come back later and we'll ask her questions. To be honest, I struggle with the word superpower because it's a common conversation I see on TikTok. Personally, that word doesn't really resonate with me because I can see why people would utilize that word to describe certain things. But the thing I would say is that what's going on in our heads is, for the simplest way to explain it for somebody who maybe doesn't have ADHD, it's complete chaos in our brain 24/7. There is multiple things happening at any given time about different topics, different people, different subjects. We ruminate over a conversation that we had if we felt like something felt off. The person maybe didn't fully, like us, or it just something didn't sit right. We pick up on energy in a room immediately. If I could always walk into a room and know if there was a fight there a few minutes before I walked in the room, I instantly knew that. And we take in so much information at once that sometimes it is overwhelming. And so we're sorting through things in our brains. And also a lot of us have a narration going in our heads. I had a conversation with somebody who is definitely not neurodivergent. And I was like, don't you have the voice in your head that's talking to you? And he's like, really? Do you have voice in your head? And I was like, no, but you walking down the street and you'll have this kind of narration happening. We're like, oh, look at the trees. It looks nice. And he's like, no, I think about what I want. My brain is quiet. And I was like, tell me what you mean by that. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand about us, is that it is 10 times harder, I think, to do some of the more simple things, to stay organized, to stay on task, to stay on topic, and that we're exhausted. And if you're exhausted, we're definitely exhausted. And so the superpower thing, I think it hits me in a way where I'm like, it doesn't fully appreciate the challenges of what many of us struggle with, especially if people are unmedicated. When I started taking medicine for ADHD, it completely changed. And I almost cried because I thought, imagine what I could have done if I was medicated, 20 years ago, because it wasn't until I was almost 40 years old that I was medicated finally. And I sat with that and I remember being really hurt and thinking, how much have I missed out on? What potential have I not been able to reach even in myself because I couldn't shut this off? I couldn't sort through this on my own. I just flitted from one thing to the next, not because I didn't want to finish things or didn't want to do things. It was because my brain prevented me from doing those things. And so I think it's really important that I share that in this context because yeah, there are some things that I've started to appreciate about my ADHD. The way I see problems, the way I can arrange things quickly and pull things together and zoom forward in my head in terms of ideas, and making those connections. But it's not without a little bit of a cost, I guess is the only way I could describe it. So it feels a little bit heavier, if that makes sense.
That makes complete sense, Jen. And the question which comes to my mind is, who are the people who actually understood you, who gave you that energy, enabled your journey, your go-to people, your safe space, in the many years?
Yeah, there'd be so many too many to mention, because at different places in my journey, people played such different roles that helped me reveal things about myself and just the world and my perspective. I talked about earlier, my friend Reem, who, she was the one who hired me originally, and we connected, and she had and still does, such a great understanding of me and my brain, where it would kind of be like a little bit of a joke where, I would do something or I would say something, and she said, of course, because that's just who you are. And it was so funny because I'd be like, I feel so seen. I feel so heard, and something would happen on a project or something I was working on, when she was, our division head. And, I would say, I just don't think, and she's like, I know, I completely understand where you're coming from. I knew you were going to say that. And how about do it the way you think, and let's come back to it later. And she still does. We work together on LEWAS still. And it's because of her knowing me and my brain and the excitement I have in exploring new topics and wanting to just put all my energy into things, is how I was able to be part of, bringing the Symposium aspect to LEWAS, with her and some other people, and building workshops and speaking and trying those things out, but also being able to share my passion in those things.
So the fact that you said she understood you, was it a journey?
I think it's that there's some people who take the time to observe and understand others, and they don't place their expectations onto other people. They just listen. They step back and they give you space, and they give you space. I mean, the one thing I think the thread would be for everybody who has played a significant part in my journey is that the common thread would be that they quickly appreciated that I was who I was, and that they weren't always going to fully understand how I got somewhere or why I came up with an idea, but they were willing to hear it out. And they were willing also to make mistakes and ask questions, and vice versa, right? And the other thing that I will say is that they allowed the unfiltered me to come to them. Because the other thing that I will say that I personally struggle with as someone with ADHD and some other things is, like, when you're passionate about something, it's easy to get emotional about it as well. And ADHD, we do tend to also struggle with emotional regulation, right? So if I was upset about something, I was angry, I was sad, excited, I would come in and I might say what exactly was on my head and my brain. But there'd be times where with certain people, I'd have to say, look, I need to get this out the only way I know how, so that we can process it together, right? But that was exhausting even for me to say that sometimes, because if I had to say that to somebody, so that they wouldn't hold what I said against me if I didn't say it exactly, properly, professionally, whatever, I didn't want it to come back to bite me, and sometimes it would. Yeah. So people that helped me on this journey, and I could say, Reem, my old supervisor, Crystal, my old supervisor, Jaffer, like, these are people that I could say exactly what I thought in that moment at my most vulnerable. And they would say, okay, so what I'm getting from you is this. And I would say, yes, that's what I meant if I was going to be professional about it. And they'd say, okay, let's work together on this, And I really, really appreciated that, because that ability to be unfiltered and feel safe with people, I think, was the other thing. Being heard is such a critical part of who we are as people. But being heard when you're neurodivergent, being heard on a level and not having it be held against you. Because there was times where I could say something out of pocket, not intentionally, or something would pop in my head and I wouldn't know that maybe it was offensive to somebody. No idea. Especially early in my career. And someone would say, you can't just say that, and it's like, okay. And then you learn also how to navigate those things, how to articulate those things. But there's still going to be moments where you're going to say, I just need to get this out. So that I think it would be the common thread with so many of the people that I have valued and felt really seen by, and were mentors as well. And they taught me so much about myself and how I can be better.
Beautiful. Jen, you spoke about, we struggle with emotional regulation, right? How did it manifest? And how did you then learn to, overcome it, deal with it, navigate it?
Yeah, I think I'm still learning. I mean, every situation is different. And the thing is, at least for me, I can't speak about anybody else, obviously, but my emotions are also closely tied to my values. And for part of the reason that I do diversity and inclusion, a lot of focus on that over the years was because of my sense of justice and fairness. And if I feel like something is unfair, I'm going to get angry. Straight up. I'm just going to get mad. I'm not always going to tell you that I'm mad. I'm not always going to show you that I'm mad, but the fury will go from like 0 to 1,000 like this. For example, there was a scenario in which I had spent months researching and building a course. And I was exceptionally proud of this course. And it was actually something that, it was decided by our higher ups that it would be used to teach everybody else and be kind of the framework for every other course that was developed after that. And I was completely honored by that. But then in the same breath, I get somebody coming to me a few days later and saying, we like it, but actually, can you just cut it in half? And I was instantly angry because I'm like, first of all, respect my integrity as a course designer, as a professional, as a psychologist who has spent countless hours of research and time building this session to create a journey for people. And I said no. And then I was like, take a breath. And I said, but if you would like a course that is shorter, I will build you one. But because of the way these things are built, I can't just cut it in half. And I'm happy to explain to you why in more detail. And that was just one example. And it became where, okay, well then let's look at what other things we can do. Or let's put it on hold for right now. We'll come back to it later. I would never walk into another professional's office and say, well, can't you just do it shorter? Can't you just build the rocket faster? You're a PhD, aren't you? You're an engineer, aren't you? And it's like, oh, that would be so insulting to somebody. And it felt insulting, even though I knew that's not how they meant it, right? Their assumption was like, of course you could do it because you're the expert. So you can just quickly. And it's like, take a deep breath, Jen. So that I think is one example that kind of made me like laugh in the moment because I was like, no, okay, wait, but it's still a struggle. And there's still times where I have to pause and go, okay, everybody, what are we trying to accomplish here? Because this feels this way to me. And I've also learned that regardless if it's a professional setting or not, it's still okay to say, I feel, I think, because when you were saying earlier, if we, especially with ADHD, if we find something we're passionate about, it's so easy for us to do it, right? And I think when all of these things are connected within us, we take those things seriously. And, I have always been passionate about helping people and doing my part to make sure that other people do not have to experience, the hurt or the pain that I have gone through in certain scenarios in my life. And I don't want that for other people. So I fight my hardest to try and make sure that other people don't. But it's sometimes hard for me to remember that not everybody sees it that way. But it's also sometimes being honest with somebody and saying, I feel this way. And look, I'm a little upset right now. I need a minute.
What would you want the listeners to remember about what it means to be different, neurodivergent, having ADHD?
That's a tough one. Honestly, I think the thread throughout my entire life has just been hoping that people take the time to understand other people and not automatically make assumptions about us. Because just as I'm talking about my experience as somebody with different neurodivergencies, it's not going to be the same for everybody. Somebody else listening could say, I also have ADHD and I'm a woman and I feel completely different. And so I think that's important. Understanding that people are people, right? And we have this, I think, attitude about people being at work and saying, well, you leave your personal stuff at home and you come to the office and you work and you just do your job. But that's physically impossible. I can't take a part out of my brain and leave it home because that's the part of my brain that actually helps me the most.
Yeah.
As frustrating as it can be, you're two sides of the coin. And so I think I would just say, like, if people learn anything from this, it's that no two people will ever have the same experience or the same opinion on things. And it's, I think, about asking questions and getting to know people and not making decisions for them on behalf of them. And I think the reality is that when people feel heard, when people feel like they matter, they're willing to step up, they're willing to deliver for you. It builds trust. It builds teamwork. It creates new ideas, the freedom to want to create new ideas. When people feel safe around others and knowing that if they share these pieces of themselves, it's not going to be, you're less than in some way. It's just who you are. And I want to appreciate that about you. It's not that they're always going to like me. There's people that I've worked with over the years that we don't like each other, but we respect each other because for whatever reason, our personalities clash. But I always thought, you know what? I'm so lucky that that person is my balance because they keep me honest and I help be creative, right? So I think those are the big things. Just reaching out to understand each other, especially now.
Thank you, Jen. You brought in your authentic self, you brought in your vulnerable self, and I can only imagine how many people it's going to help, resonate with, and give perspective to. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It was such a pleasure. And if anyone has any questions or more, or please, reach out to me. I'm always happy to, especially talk to people that are maybe navigating some of this for themselves. Being neurodivergent is something that the world is just starting to talk about more openly. And of course, there's an influx of videos on TikTok, but I will say, people, I love TikTok, but don't just rely on those, even though that it's made for people like us, the neurodivergent ones. But, there's a lot of information out there that isn't always accurate. And I think it's important that we come together and be honest about our journeys and know that there's not going to be a checkbox for how we operate in the world, for how anybody operates in the world. And so it's been a pleasure to share a little bit snapshot about what it's like for me, and hopes that it helps somebody else or helps an organization in thinking about how maybe they approach.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, do hang on for just one more minute. I have a request for you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Atlanta Diaries on Spotify, iTunes, or whichever platform you follow. Do join us in our mission to empower and inspire by sharing the podcast with a friend or colleague. It will be great if you can share on the social media platforms you follow, be it LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or any other. Please leave a review or rating on iTunes or Spotify. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Lastly, I wanted to share with you that many of my coaching clients and listeners have created a cheat sheet with their key takeaways from the episodes. I invite you to consider jotting down 1 or 2 key takeaways as you navigate your amazing journey. Have a wonderful rest of the day and see you next week for another inspiring journey on Atlanta Diaries.